Well, y'all, thank you for making it out tonight. Diane said this is like the second time that we've thought it's just going to be like a studio recording tonight because of the weather. This was a monsoon tonight. I mean, an absolute torrential downpour. So thanks for making it out. We're going to jump right in. People may be coming a little bit later, and the weather, it may drown me out. It was so loud earlier that I thought we wouldn't be able to hear me. January 10th, 1950, a letter arrived at the Kilns from an American lady. She was in a painful marriage to a novelist. He was the author of Monster Midway and Nightmare Alley, William Lindsay Gresham. He lived from 1909 to 62. He was an alcoholic and wife abuser who would go on to abandon her and their two boys. He pursued torrid affairs with multiple other women, and their mutual atheistic disdain for all things supernatural, along with their mutual anti-Americanism and communism, had initially drawn them together. In fact, they actually met, Joy and William, at a local Communist Party meeting for young writers. Joy Davidman was born in New York City, 1915. The elder of two children, two school teacher parents. Their Jewishness was purely cultural, not religious. Her father was a proud atheist. Joy was a brilliant young lady, genius IQ, photographic memory, very analytic and logical. From Hunter College, she attended Columbia University, did her master's, becoming a published poet even before beginning her master's degree. By the time she married Gresham, she had already published her first novel 2 years prior, a novel entitled Anya. The two would eventually become disillusioned with communism and the failed modernist movement. You'll recall my discussion a couple of times about how the modernist project collapsed at the onset of two world wars. And if you have questions about that, maybe afterwards tonight we can talk about it. But the thought of raising a family in anything resembling the Soviet Union was unconscionable to them, so they were disillusioned at this point. Now, a little bit of backtracking here will be helpful. Joy wrote later an autobiographical sketch, and she entitled it The Longest Way Round. She wrote it in 1951. Now, these dates tonight are going to be pretty important to help you kind of keep track of Joy and Jack and the trajectory of things. But she writes this autobiographical sketch in 1951, The Longest Way Round, reflecting on life prior to her marriage to Gresham. She said, "In 1929, I believed in nothing but American prosperity. In 1930, I believed in nothing. Men, I said, are only apes. Virtue is only custom. Life is only an electromechanical reaction. Mind is only a set of conditioned reflexes. And anyway, most people aren't rational like me." Caps, capital M, capital E. "Love, art, and altruism are only sex." And the word sex is ultimately the only sort of purpose or goal for anything that we do. Love, art, and altruism are only sex. The universe is only matter. Matter is only energy. I forgot what I said energy was only. Can I read that again? I want you to get a feel for Joy looking back on her young atheistic life. In 1929, I believed in nothing but American prosperity. In 1930, I believed in nothing. Men, I said, are only apes. Virtue is only custom. Life is only an electromechanical reaction. Mind is only a set of conditioned reflexes. And anyway, most people aren't rational like me. Love, art, and altruism are only sex. The universe is only matter. Matter is only energy. I forget what I said energy was only. It was during this period in the 1930s that she embraced atheism and communism. As she lived for self, she couldn't, however, escape this nagging feeling she would have when she would go out and see hungry men selling apples on the street trying to make a living. It demanded a callousness to be prosperous. It demanded a callousness when she saw suffering around her that she just wasn't capable of that kind of callousness. She wanted to do something. And so she joined the Communist Party and started writing for their magazine, New Masses. Gresham, who had considered becoming a Unitarian minister, had previously married fought as a freedom fighter in the Spanish Civil War, came back mentally unstable, attempted suicide, but later took solace and meaning in psychoanalysis and the Communist Party. After he and Joy married on August 2nd, 1942, his addictions took hold. Where was hope to be had? As Gresham's drunkenness and adultery spiraled, Joy was in utter despair in her life. She said in The Longest Way Around, again that was written in 1951, "All my defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksureness and self-love behind which I had hid from God, went down momentarily, and God came in." She described herself as, quote, "the world's most surprised atheist." Does that sound familiar? Didn't someone once describe himself as the most reluctant convert in all England? Well, she and Bill, her husband, both professed faith in Jesus, and they and their sons were baptized at Pleasant Plains Presbyterian Church in New York. Now, Chad Walsh is C.S. Lewis' Apostle to the Skeptics, 1949. We mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. Came across Joy's path. She checked into this pint-loving writer from the UK and decided to send him a piece of fan mail, and they became pen pals. We don't have many letters from this period between Joy and Jack. We have one, 1953, and two, 1959, from Jack to Joy. One from Joy to Jack, March 8, 1959. So what was that first letter of January 10th, 1950 all about? So bear in mind, they've been writing back and forth, but Jack has been writing to literally hundreds and hundreds of people. He answered virtually all of his mail. People would always write, not just fan mail to tell him how much they loved his books, but they had questions that would arise having read his books, and he was always keen to reply as best he could to their letters, and that's what was going on here. Now, one clue as to what that first letter that we still don't have, but one clue as to that first letter of January 10th, 1950 is in Lyle Dorset's 1983 book, And God Came In, the extraordinary story of Joy Davidman, her life and marriage to C.S. Lewis. Joy, you see, had sent a letter to Chad Walsh on January 27th, 1950. You keeping these dates together? It's going to be a date-heavy night, y'all. So she sends her first letter to Lewis, January 10th, 1950. The next piece of correspondence relevant to our story is a letter from Joy to Chad Walsh, who was a friend of hers, January 27th, 1950. Upon receiving a letter in return to her January 10th, 1950 letter to C.S. Lewis. And she writes to Chad Walsh, "Just got a letter from Lewis in the mail. I think I told you I'd raise an argument or two on some points. Lord, he knocked my props out from under me unerringly. One shot to a pigeon. I haven't a scrap of my case left. And what's more, I've seldom enjoyed anything more. Being disposed of so neatly by a master of debate, all fair and square, it seems to be one of the great pleasures of life, though I'd never have suspected it in my arrogant youth. I suppose it's unfair tricks of argument that leave wounds, but after the sort of thing that Lewis does, what I feel is a craftsman's joy at the sight of a superior performance." Over the next couple of years, Jack and Joy traded letters as she revealed Bill's drunkenness and serial adultery. Lewis would try to counsel her in their correspondence. By August of 1952, she needed space from Bill. He, having rejected his professed faith in Christ, was now dabbling in I Ching, tarot cards, L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology, Zen Buddhism. Her cousin, Mrs. Renee Pierce from Florida, herself a victim of an abusive husband, brought her own two young children to Joy's house to watch over David and Douglas, Joy and Bill's two young sons, so that Joy could get away. Joy sailed to England. Bill and Renee started an affair. Joy stayed with a friend, Phyllis Williams, in London, and together they went to Oxford, where they had invited Jack to have lunch with them at the Eastgate Hotel, which is across from Magdalen College, September 24th. Now, Eastgate Hotel is going to come up again in just a few minutes. She would spend that Christmas year with Jack and Warnie. Now, Joy had read the works of George MacDonald as a young girl, the Scottish theologian and an author. And she would later say, quote, They developed in me a taste for fantasy, which led me years later to C.S. Lewis, who in turn led me to religion. Lewis, that Christmas, gave Joy his own autographed copy of George MacDonald's A Diary of an Old Soul. Joy copied Jack's poem, The Apologist's Evening Prayer, on the inside cover of the book on January 1st, 1953. And she asked him to autograph her own copy of The Great Divorce that she had brought with her. And Lewis wrote in her copy of The Great Divorce, which you can pick up over here.
That same copy?
That same copy is going to cost you. In her own copy, she wrote, which was now, written in by Lewis. Lewis wrote, "There are 3 images in my mind which I must continually forsake and replace with better ones. The false image of God, the false image of my neighbors, and the false image of myself." Christmas, December 30th, 1952. David and Douglas Gresham, her sons, would later admit, when they were older in life, that their mother had designs for Jack when she left for London. While she had been staying with the Lewises, Joy received a letter from Bill informing her he wanted a divorce so that he and Renee could marry. Now, another woman had designs on Lewis. You'll recall Mrs. Hooker, C.S. Lewis's wife. Well, from jail, she wrote letters insisting that if they weren't married, they were at least engaged. Back in the States, Joy, Bill, and Renee lived together for over a month. So she comes back to the States because she wanted to try to salvage her marriage. But when she gets back to her house, of course, her cousin is there. Joy was attempting to salvage the sinking marriage. Renee would cry in her bed from shame for what she had done. Bill would violently berate Joy for her lack of Christian charity in not allowing Renee to sleep with him. Joy, knowing her husband, didn't blame Renee. Joy agreed to Bill's demand for divorce, which would be finalized August 1954. It was during the season that Jack finished The Magician's Nephew and The Last Battle of the Chronicles. Tolkien was editing the galleys of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Back in New York, the sizable house in which Joy and Bill lived, Renee, having left for Florida to divorce her husband, was witness to a violent and disintegrating marriage. They were in financial trouble due to Bill's dwindling career. He had made some money writing and a couple of his novels becoming movies, and that's why they had the house, but now they couldn't afford it. After their eventual divorce, Joy would sell the house to pay off their debts to the IRS. While waiting for the divorce to be final, Joy saved her money so that she and her 2 sons could escape the abusive environment in which they lived. She became an Anglomaniac, as she called it. The first week of November 1953, she sailed with David and Douglas for England and took up residence at the Avoca House Hotel, 43 Belize Park in Hampstead. And they would make a 4-day visit to the Lewises in Oxford. Douglas had already read the first 4 Narnian stories. He expected to meet, as he said, a heroic figure. Instead, he found the great C.S. Lewis, a slightly stooped, round-shouldered, balding gentleman. Jack enjoyed the spirited American boys, but found them more energetic than a, quote, celibate could handle. Now that's going to be important for understanding Lewis. He viewed himself as a celibate. He viewed himself as a confirmed bachelor. And he had correspondence with women. He was friends with women. In fact, had great respect for the talents of women. Not the least of which was Dorothy Sayers or his poet friend Ruth Pitter. Had great respect, but again, he was part of a boys' club called the Inklings, and women weren't allowed in the Inklings, and he and Warnie were confirmed bachelors. And yes, his house had been open, as we discovered last week, to 19 young ladies who had been displaced in London because of the air raids and the bombings and so forth. But he was a celibate. He was a confirmed bachelor. Now, some of Jack's friends had designs to set him up with Ruth Pitter, the poet we've discussed a couple of weeks ago. She was his age and had moved conveniently to the nearby village of Long Crendon. Even Lewis had admitted at one point that were he the marrying type, Ruth would be ideal. Alas, he was a confirmed bachelor, and nothing was ever going to change that. In fact, he even had the idea of having his two friends, Ruth and Joy, meet. He had even arranged a lunch for them at the Eastgate Hotel, that same hotel that I mentioned earlier. Only he had not informed either of them of the other. Joy nor Ruth were amused. Joy nor Ruth would ever meet again. Warnie had noted that Joy had a, quote, good figure. She had a good figure. In other words, she was easy on the eyes. And she was Jack's equal in nimbleness of mind. Warnie knew Joy's design from the very beginning. Jack, however, was strictly and sincerely platonic in what he envisioned for their relationship. But the pursuit of Joy was in full swing. And while I haven't the time to properly discuss this, it was during this season that Oxford's Merton College passed over Jack for the chair of English literature, much to the disappointment of his friend Tolkien, who was lobbying hard for this appointment for his friend Jack. The reason was that Jack was a, quote, hot gospeler. Right? His fame had spread on both sides of the Atlantic. He was a, quote, hot gospeler. He's writing all these Christian apologetic books and books for children about Christianity. And that just seemed beneath what would be required for such a lofty position. Helen Gardner, who was one of the eventual editors of the Oxford Book of English Verse. You need to have in your library the Oxford Book of English Verse, but you need the 1900 edition that was edited by Arthur Quiller Couch. They are out of print, and they are as rare as hen teeth to find. But if you ever stumble upon one, you need to get it. That's the original. It's called The Q, Arthur Quiller Couch. Helen Gardner, who was a contemporary of Lewis, would later edit a revised version of the Oxford Book of English Verse. I have both of them back here if you'd like to see them. But Helen Gardner would later say in Jack's obituary for the British Academy after Jack had died that Oxford had no interest in a professor of literature who had won fame as an amateur theologian. However, on January 18, 1954, Cambridge University informed Lewis that they had established a new chair of medieval and Renaissance English and that their electors had unanimously and warmly and enthusiastically voted to extend this call to him. And this appointment would have been a dream for Jack. However, he had to refuse as he knew that he had to care for his brother Warnie, whose mental condition and drinking was worsening. We're going to find in the story tonight that Warnie's drinking benders just increase as the years go by. He had to take care of his brother. He had a gardener. He had others there, a housekeeper, others who were dependent upon him in Oxford. And so he simply couldn't uproot and move from Oxford 3 hours away by train to Cambridge. Tolkien intervened and assured the electors at Cambridge that if they could provide Lewis with rooms and not require Jack to leave his housekeeping in Oxford, but only be in Cambridge 4 days a week, it just might work. And Jack agreed that he could work and sleep on trains, so he could be in Cambridge for part of each week during the terms and then back home on weekends. One of the electors hearing this replied, quote, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." And so this was that Pauline Macedonian call that Jack heard. Yes, we will accommodate you. We'll give you rooms here. You don't have to move here and be residential. Just be here a few days a week. You can go back on the weekends. You can go back during the summers. Just come and help us. But again, Lewis knew that he couldn't leave Oxford because there were too many people depending on him there. Before Lewis finished at Oxford and made way for Cambridge, a debate was arranged in London. Kathleen Nott, N-O-T-T, published The Emperor's Clothes, in which she described this book as an attack on the dogmatic orthodoxy of T.S. Eliot, Graham Greene, Dorothy L. Sayers, C.S. Lewis, and others. In other words, all of these famous poets and novelists who had professed faith in Christ, who had themselves become Christians, Kathleen Nott writes this book to take them down and to belittle and to criticize them. And so a debate was set up in London scheduled for October 27th, 1945 at St. Anne's Church in Soho, London. Lewis writes to Sayers to let her know that he will be present for the, quote, nicking of Nott. Last minute, Kathleen Nott withdrew from the debate. She pulled out of the debate and left her friend G.S. Fraser to face Sayers and Lewis alone. And I can't think of many things that would be more intimidating to have to stand up to Dorothy Sayers. If you've read much of Dorothy Sayers, you realize that she was a woman of labyrinthine mind and just razor sharp intellect. The intellectual horsepower, the combined intellectual horsepower of Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis would have been insurmountable. So she pulls out of the debate, leaves her friend Fraser to meet them. Now, interestingly, at this debate, Joy Davidman's parents had come over from New York to spend time with her. And of course, Joy went to this debate in London and brought her parents with her, and they met Lewis. Lewis introduced them all to Dorothy Sayers, whom Joy described as, quote, enormously witty and a very eloquent speaker, a forthcoming old lady who wears rather mannish clothes and doesn't give a damn about her hairdo. Jack's inaugural lecture the next year, 1954, at Cambridge was entitled Descriptione Temporum. November 29th, 1954 was his 56th birthday when this lecture was given. The place was so packed with students from Oxford, friends from Oxford, new students at Cambridge, new friends at Cambridge, the electors at Cambridge. People had come from all over to hear what was no doubt a pretty monumental inaugural, given that he had been at Oxford all these years and is now moving to Cambridge. And people were sitting on the floor. There was just no room left in the lecture hall. And I'm going to read a passage here out of Descriptione Temporum, which again wasn't, available to most of us until much later, after you can see it in the collections of essays that we have on the table over here. But I will often read this quotation whenever I, travel on either side of the Atlantic, Asia, Europe, and talk about issues of worldview and so forth. I'll be often asked to come and speak on sort of the history of philosophy, the history of Marxism, the rise of postmodernism, metamodernism, and those kinds of things. And as usual, Lewis, writing decades ago, is nonetheless so prophetic. Listen to what he says. Listen to what he chooses to say as a professor of English. He's laying the gauntlet down in this inaugural address. Now keep in mind, Oxford has passed him over precisely because he won't be quiet about his Christianity. Remember, he's a hot gospeler. So you think he'd have learned his lesson by now and behave a little better now that he has this prestigious chair at Cambridge. He says, the christening of Europe seemed to all our ancestors, whether they welcomed it themselves as Christians or, like Gibbon, deplored it as humanistic unbelievers, a unique, irreversible event. But we have seen the opposite process. Of course, the unchristening of Europe in our time is not quite complete. Neither was her christening in the Dark Ages. But, roughly speaking, we may say that whereas all history was for our ancestors divided into two periods, the pre-Christian and the Christian, and two only, for us it falls into three: the pre-Christian, the Christian, and what may reasonably be called the post-Christian. This surely must make a momentous difference. And again, I will often quote that whenever I'm lecturing, teaching at seminaries, or whatever I'm doing, because again, it's so prophetic. And Lewis is saying this in 54. And he's saying this to Cambridge, letting them know the new chair of English and Renaissance literature here is an unwavering Christian. And he's saying where we are right now is not Christian Europe. We are in a post-Christian Europe. Lewis recognized that the modernist project had collapsed. In fact, how many of you have read the Space Trilogy? It's called the Space Trilogy or the Ransom series. You'll probably know as you've read that it seems to be just under the surface that what he is attacking in all three volumes is the modernist project. In fact, for instance, Night of the Silent Planet, he he names H.G. Wells. He's not disrespectful of him, but he names H.G. Wells and the modernist, Darwinian, materialist presuppositions that Wells brings to the table. Weston and Devine in Out of the Silent Planet are themselves, hard-boiled atheists. They are about the survival of the species and for what purpose. And in many ways, the whole of the Space Trilogy is a condemnation of modernism and a realization that postmodernism is on the horizon, but not just that. In that hideous strength, he's not only done away with modernism, he's not only predicted postmodernism, he's actually prophesying in embryonic form metamodernism. And he's doing something similar to this. This reminds me of Charles Taylor, who wrote the book Secular Age. Have any of you heard of Secular Age by Charles Taylor? It's about a 1,000-page volume, not exactly a beach read. It's a 1,000-page volume of deep sort of intellectual theology. And Charles Taylor, it was published back in 2006. And here we are almost, 20 years later, and it's so relevant. He says that there are essentially three intellectual epochs in our existence. Prior to the Enlightenment, he described it as the impossibility of unbelief. Like prior to the 1700s, you could not retain intellectual credibility and disbelieve Christianity. So prior to the Enlightenment, the impossibility of unbelief. After the Enlightenment, so let's think after Hume and Kant in the 1700s, after the Enlightenment, he describes it as the possibility of unbelief. Now you could retain intellectual credibility and doubt the Christian faith. In what he calls the modern period, which he designates as after 9/11, the impossibility of belief. Has it ever seemed curious to you that we never really had that sort of cottage industry of neo-atheism and bestsellers like The God Delusion or Letter to a Christian Nation or God is Not Great? When did those books hit the shelves and become New York Times bestsellers books? It wasn't until the Twin Towers fell. So I think Taylor's onto something there. I don't agree with Taylor on a great many things. I don't agree with him that it was the Protestant Reformation that disenchanted the world because of their misunderstanding of the sacraments. He believes the Protestants, such as Calvin, had a low view of the sacraments, which tells me he simply never read Calvin, and I don't really mean that. Taylor himself is a Roman Catholic. It just tells me he's never read Calvin. Calvin wrote voluminously. Luther wrote voluminously. The Reformers wrote voluminously on the sacraments. You disagree with them if you want, but they didn't ignore the sacraments. But again, I don't agree with Taylor on everything, but again, a penetrating analysis of our current sort of cultural moment. Lewis is like that here with what he writes in the Space Trilogy, or what he's saying here in Descriptione Temporum. Lewis took up residence in his rooms at Cambridge January 1st, 1955. He lectured on poetry, Milton, Spenser's Faerie Queene. Lewis would characterize the difference between Oxford and Cambridge as one of philosophy and the other of literary criticism. He says you were never safe from the philosopher at Oxford, and you were never safe from the literary critic at Cambridge. And students at either institutions had to conform to one of these positions in both places. At Cambridge, Lewis found himself in the forefront of defending against literary deconstructionism. So if you have been to college in the last 40 years, 50 years, you have been trained, whether you realize it or not, in literary deconstructionism. Lewis is on the forefront of that, defending against. In other words, what does it come down to in a nutshell? Lewis actually believed that texts had meaning. And he believed in a thing called authorial intent rather than reader response. Meaning this, that the author of a text wrote the text, meaning what the text meant as it was written. In other words, texts were not like abstract pieces of art that we could, as it were, impregnate with meaning to fit whatever agenda was current. And so Lewis believed in authorial intent. Saturday, November 5th, 1955, Lewis received a visit from none other than Dr. Billy Graham, who was in Cambridge for a crusade. And because of Graham's critics there, stringent security had to be put in place. And Lewis told Graham when they met, quote, "You know you have many critics, but I've never met one of your critics who knows you personally." So really interesting, those two titans in their own respects meeting. Graham met with Lewis. He met with John Stott while he was there. Jack went back and forth, Cambridge to Oxford, on the 3-hour-long train ride called the Cantab Crawler. It was a regularly scheduled train from Oxford to Cambridge and back. It was slow as Christmas, but he liked it. He liked it because it gave him time to just look at the countryside and think and reflect and read. The Tuesday Inklings meetings, remember the Thursday night Inklings meetings had come to an end, but they retained their Tuesday lunch meetings at the Bird and Baby or the Eagle and Child. The Inklings moved their Tuesday meetings to Mondays to accommodate, shifted to Mondays to accommodate Lewis. And he enjoyed these long, slow train rides in his time back in Oxford every week. But back and forth he would go. Now, during the Christmas break of 1955, Lewis embarked on his most ambitious and, for some, his best work. What do you think that is? Not Narnia, though Narnia is everybody's favorite probably, but for true Lewisians, for snooty Lewisians, for like the really like the really the snobby Lewisians, for whom all of us sort of plebeians who read Narnia or Screwtape, they just sort of pat us on the heads, but they have read. Let me see if I can find it here. They have read. Let's see if I can find this without knocking over all my Lord of the Rings action figures. They have read and prefer this. This is a first British edition of Till We Have Faces. And so he begins in 55, Till We Have Faces. Most Lewisians you talk to there's variegated opinion. Is it Till We Have Faces? For some, it's The Great Divorce. But for the really snooty ones, right, it's Till We Have Faces. Anyway, he begins work on Till We Have Faces during this period, and he would consider it himself, along with Perelandra, to be an example of sort of the higher reaches of his mature abilities. But here's the thing, in many ways, Till We Have Faces, some would say Till We Have Faces ought to be it ought to be credited as authored by C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman, because she was so involved as he was crafting the drafts of the chapters. She was so integral to the input of what eventually became Till We Have Faces. And in many ways, Till We Have Faces would not be what it is were it not for her razor-sharp mind and the way that they connected. Joy was at Kilns almost every day. All around them, people thought this was headed toward marriage. Jack had no such idea. Joy moved from London with her 2 sons to a little house just down the street from the Kilns. The Home Office in Britain soon refused to allow Joy to remain as an American and work in England. Jack conceived the solution. Go to the civil registrar office and just have a very formal agreement of marriage drawn up, which in his mind was not an actual marriage, but simply a matter of a legal form that would allow her to stay in England. Now, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, viewed marriage to someone previously married as an instance of adultery. Jack agreed and was not about to enter into that situation. Again, this was purely a formality in his mind. This was April 23rd, 1956. Warney writes in his diary, November 5th, 1956, Jack assured me that Joy would continue to occupy her own house as Mrs. Gresham, and that the marriage was a pure formality designed to give Joy the right to go on living in England. And I saw the uselessness of disabusing him. Joy, whose intentions were obvious from the outset, soon began to press for her rights, pointing out with perfect truth that her reputation was suffering from Jack's being in her house every day, often stopping until 11 at night, and all the arrangements had been made for the installation of the family at the Kilns when disaster overtook us. Having just turned 42, Joy started complaining of pain in her left leg and her back and her chest. She was diagnosed quickly with rheumatism and fibrosis, and Jack returns to Cambridge. On the evening of October 18th, 1956, back in Headington, at Joy's house, the one that she had taken with her kids before she had moved into the Kilns. Back at Joy's house, October 18, 1956, she heard the phone ring. Her friend, Catherine Farrar, her friend had just had this sort of inexplicable sense that something was not quite well with Joy, and so she told her husband, I simply must call her. And so the phone rang, and Joy gets up to go answer the phone, and she trips over the phone line, and her left femur snaps like a twig. The next thing you know, she is in incredible pain. On the other end of the phone, Catherine can only sit there helpless as her friend screams out in excruciating and indescribable pain. So on October 19th, the next day, at the Wingfield Morris Orthopedic Hospital, x-rays showed that her left femur had been eaten through with cancer. There was also a tumor in her breast, her right leg, and her shoulder as well. She immediately had surgery to remove the cancer from her leg and breast, and her ovaries were also removed. Jack, the confirmed bachelor, had never felt romantic love, or what he would call in the four loves, eros, romantic love, sensual love. He'd never felt that for Joy. Jack now felt overwhelming compassion, pity for her. He wanted her to die in the Kilns as his wife, not just a formal legal matter. But this for Jack could only be if it were a Christian marriage. He went to see Harry Carpenter, the Bishop of Oxford, and laid out his case. He lobbied that an ecclesiastically approved marriage was possible, as William Gresham, remember, had been married previously, prior to his marriage to Joy, that his first wife was actually still alive, and that the second marriage, therefore, was invalid. And that would be the position of the Roman Catholic Church. But the Anglican Church holds that every legal marriage is a valid marriage. The bishop said no, that he would not approve and give an ecclesial blessing despite their situation. He would not approve and give an ecclesial blessing to Jack's marriage to Joy on account of Lewis's celebrity. And if I do it for you, everybody's going to expect it. And Jack was crushed. Around this time, an antique dealer in London began telling people that Lewis's books were love letters to her, and that she alone had the key to interpret them. No, this is not the lady who is in jail. This is a lady in London who is an antique dealer. Lewis had traded some letters, as again he had done with hundreds and hundreds of people. Again, he answered virtually every piece of mail that he received, but Lewis stopped all correspondence with her at this point, realizing how unstable she was, but this didn't slow her down. She started writing as many as 3 letters a day. And as soon as they would come, he would dispatch them to the fire. Even his friend Owen Barfield, a solicitor, couldn't help him. I mean, after all, there's nothing illegal about sending letters. Next thing, a reporter from London's Daily Mail went to Cambridge to inquire with Lewis about his impending marriage to this antique dealer. Scheduled at the registrar's office in London on Saturday, October 27th. So all this is happening without Lewis knowing anything. He's never even met this woman. And yet she's gone and scheduled a marriage that's going to take place. The October 26th edition, which was just the day before the marriage was scheduled to take place, the October 26th edition of the Daily Mail contained an article entitled, in all caps, "Mary, ? I'll be miles away," says the professor. And there was also a picture of Lewis and this lady antique dealer amidst all of her antiques and bric-a-brac and china cats and other pieces. But the china cow was out of the barn. Rumors were swirling that C.S. Lewis was about to be married. So Lewis had the following announcement run in the Times. December 25th, 1956, a marriage has taken place between Professor C.S. Lewis of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and Mrs. Joy Gresham, now a patient in the Churchill Hospital, Oxford. It is requested that no letters be sent. Jack followed this with letters to his closest friends, explaining the formality of their legal arrangement, their legal formal marriage. And he told Dorothy Sayers, for one, that she surely would understand that there was nothing wrong with this, as certain problems do arise between a dying woman and an elderly man, and that all this meant is that he would attain 2 nice stepsons when she passed. Lewis's former pupil, Reverend Peter Bide of the Diocese of Chichester, came at Jack's request to Oxford to lay hands on Joy in her hospital bed. Upon his arrival, Jack asked Peter to marry them, which he did. Warnie ends up writing in his diary that this was the saddest thing that he had ever seen. Warnie says that it really wasn't proper for Reverend Peter Bide to do this. This wasn't his diocese. He didn't really have the right to do it. But nonetheless, Warnie was there, and Peter Bide, and a few others, Sister Penelope, and they came in, they had communion together, and Peter Bide married them. Joy then moves in to the Kilns to die. In fact, when they moved her in, she was in such shape that there was no way for her to be upstairs in a bedroom. There was Lewis's bedroom. If you're up there, there was Lewis's bedroom on the end of the house, and then his bedroom entered into the room that was at one point Minto's bedroom, but as soon as he never went through it, and after she passed away, that became his study, where he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. You've seen pictures of that with us there. But when Joy moved in April to die, they moved her into this room here, which was the common room. This was the room where all the guys would get together and smoke pipes and cigars and cigarettes and flick their ashes into the carpet and grind them in with their feet because, as you know, Jack and Warnie believed that would keep the moths away. So they moved Joy into this room so that she could die. But she ended up having a season of reprieve. Her cancer was halted to some degree. Now the confirmed bachelor felt eros, romantic love for Joy. Now, it is almost certain that romantic love between husband and wife was never consummated. But this is beautiful. He wrote to Dorothy Sayers on June 25th, 1957. Listen to this. This is incredible. He writes to Dorothy Sayers, quote, "They say a rival often turns a friend into a lover. Thanatos, certainly, they say, approaching, but at an uncertain speed, is a most efficient rival for this purpose. We soon learn to love what we know we must lose." We soon learn to love what we know we must lose. Thanatos. What does that word mean? Death. Thanatos is approaching at an uncertain speed and is the rival that can turn a friend into a lover. In the midst of all the pain and uncertainty, along with just an inexplicable and frankly inexcusable omission, Jack didn't tell Tollers about his marriage to Joy. Didn't tell him. Tolkien had no idea Lewis had married. He found out later. He was deeply hurt, deeply offended by this. Here's the thing. Jack knew that Tolkien, strict Roman Catholic, would never have approved. I mean, after all, she's been divorced. There had been some time of cooling of relationship between Tolkien and Lewis, but this was a very significant blow to their friendship. Joy would actually recover enough to repaint the walls and do some remodeling at the kilns. Again, it had been a bachelor pad for years and years and years. And they just lived like bachelors, and they smoked and drank in this place. And she wrote to one of her friends that she was feeling enough energy to repaint the walls. And in fact, she said she stripped one of the walls down from this disgusting yellow material of almost a congealed egg yolk, and discovered underneath it these beautiful oak panels. And so she was having this great time redoing the house and just, repainting. Jack was praying at this time that God would transfer Joy's pain to himself. He became rather fixated on the idea of substitution, in which he would tell his friends that he was experiencing bone pain due to calcium loss, while Joy was growing new bone and new calcium. Lewis worked on his revision of the Psalter for the Book of Common Prayer with T.S. Eliot during this period, as well as continuing to teach at Cambridge. Joy and Jack even made a trip to Greece with a couple of friends, another couple. The wonderful story, you may have heard this, of Jack's old grumpy gardener at the kilns, who was actually the inspiration. Does anyone know who the old grumpy gardener was the inspiration for? Who? Puddleglum. Puddleglum. What was Puddleglum like? Grumpy. I mean, what's grumpier than a puddle of glum? Isn't that a great name, Puddleglum? So, the inspiration for Puddleglum was Jack's gardener. When the taxi arrived at the kilns to pick Jack and Joy up to take them to the airport in London so they could fly out to Greece, the gardener, again the inspiration for old Puddleglum, comes up and leans through the window of the taxi and says, as they were about to pull out, "Well, Mr. Jack, there was a bloke just going on over the wireless, says an airplane just went down. Everybody killed, burnt beyond recognition." Do you hear what I said, Mr. Jack? Burnt beyond recognition. Thankfully, their plane didn't crash. They made it to Athens by midnight, April 4th, 1960. Joy was not able to traverse all the terrain, but they immensely enjoyed the trip. Having returned from Greece, Lewis wrote to Chad Walsh back in the States that Joy had been divinely supported during the trip, and that she returned to Oxford in a nunc dimittis frame of mind, having realized beyond hope her greatest lifelong this worldly desire. She got to go see Greece. She had read all of the legends, all of the poetry, all of the classics, and now she's in Greece. She had read the letters of the Apostle Paul. She had read the New Testament. She longed to go to Greece, and now she comes back. Isn't that a beautiful way of saying it? She now comes back with a nunc dimittis frame of mind, like Luke chapter 2, 22 and following, with old Simeon holding baby Jesus in his arms, and he says, "Now let your servant depart in peace." And in Latin, that is known as the nunc dimittis, now depart. However, Joy's cancer was not to be overcome in this life. She was admitted to Ackland Nursing Home, which had now become a hospital. And it was there, listen to this, it was there that J.R.R. Tolkien met Joy Lewis for the first time. Why do you think that would be? because Tolkien's wife was now staying at that very same nursing home. And Tolkien had come by to visit his wife. And when he arrives, who does he find there but his friend C.S. Lewis? And so they rolled the two ladies out in wheelchairs, out onto a clearing. It was a warm day, and the two couples met, for the first time. Tolkien and his wife meeting Joy, and the two couples talked and caught up. And there began a thawing of the ice that had developed between Jack and Tollers. Joy's condition worsened. Warnie and Jack took care of her as her vomiting and her pain increased. If you read Warnie's diary back here, some of the accounts of her pain and suffering there in the kilns, and it's just excruciating. David and Douglas, her two sons, would be called home from the schools they were attending to come to the kilns as soon as possible as their time was near. Warnie went to bed on July 12th, leaving Joy and Jack in the common room, leaving them in this room right here. And they were playing Scrabble in there. Joy and Jack were. At 6 a.m. the next day, they were all awakened by terrible screaming echoing through the hallways of the kilns. The ambulance was called and she was taken to Radcliffe Infirmary. Warnie stayed home awaiting news, and that night at 11:40 p.m., Jack was driven home by a friend. Warnie writes, "I heard Jack come into the house and went out to meet him. He says, 'What's the news?' Jack, she died about 20 minutes ago." Joy was cremated, and a marble plaque near where her ashes were spread at the Oxford Crematorium reads, and I wonder who wrote these words: "Remember, Helen Joy Davidman, died July 1960, loved wife of C.S. Lewis. Here the whole world, stars, water, air, and field and forest as they were, reflected in a single mind. Like cast-off clothes was left behind, in ashes yet with hope, that she, reborn from holy poverty in Linton lands hereafter may resume them on her Easter day." This led Lewis to take 3 or 4 of those little composition notebooks. You know those old-fashioned composition notebooks? They still make them. The covers of them kind of look like the snow on a black and white TV when it's the wrong channel. Those composition notebooks. He takes 3 or 4 of them, and he decides he's simply going to limit himself to those notebooks and no more. And he just vents his grief. Stream of Consciousness, like, published under a pseudonym, September 1961, by N.W. Clerk. Warnie described the book this way, quote, "It is a grief observed from day to day in all its rawness and sinful reactions and follies. It ends with faith, but raises all the blackest doubts en route." And we'll process that book together in just a few minutes. Warnie would continue to devolve into drinking benders. Lewis continued to teach and write until his own health began to decline. He had to resign his heavy teaching load at Cambridge. August 1963, having been there 9 years. I actually have a book back here on C.S. Lewis's time at Cambridge. We always think of Lewis in Oxford, and for obvious reasons, but the Cambridge years were sweet and very productive. His new secretary, Walter Hooper, and his stepson Douglas went to Cambridge to bring his things home. For the first time, all of Lewis's books and papers were in one place at the kilns, but there were so many books and so many files, they had to get rid of other things in the house just to cram all the books in. It sounds like a good problem to me, but...
Familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Tolkien drove to the kilns to visit his friend. In fact, Tolkien writes, "We drove to the kilns for what turned out to be a very excellent time together for about an hour. I remember the conversation was very much about the Mort d'Arthur and whether trees died." Jack was ready to go. He had been awaiting during this whole season what was a hoped-for surgery for a swollen prostate, but the doctors thought that his heart would not sustain the surgery, his kidneys would not sustain the surgery. He actually had a kidney disease. They thought that his heart and his kidneys wouldn't sustain the surgery for an enlarged prostate. Surgeries back then for such matters being major invasive surgery. And so they just said, if we can get your heart and your kidneys set right, then maybe we can consider surgery. He's been waiting all this time for the possibility of surgery for an enlarged prostate, but his heart was giving out, his kidneys were giving out. He had worn a catheter all the time for some time now. He had to sleep upright in a chair for months. He was very, very zapped of energy. Interestingly, just as a little aside, remind me to mention this, when we finish, the book that he wanted as he was dying. What was the book that he wanted as he was dying, and what was the reason for that? Okay. But he's been going through all of this. His health is declining. He's 3 years in inconsolable grief. And Warnie gives us the most poignant description, I think, of the end. And of course, he is the only one who could, because he's the only one who was there. Warnie, you may recall, I think I have a picture some ways back. I'll try to show it to you when we finish here, of C.S. Lewis's bedroom. I've shown you that picture before, right? That's the actual bed that he slept in. Warnie writes in his diary, "Once again, as in the earliest days, we could turn for comfort only to each other." Isn't that a beautiful statement? Just like the early days. You remember 5 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago now when we started? We skipped a week for Thanksgiving, but do you remember how we started that an emotionally distant father, Lewis's mother dies when he's 10. They really only had each other. And that was that way despite, years of separation, different places in the war that they were assigned, and sort of different vocations and callings. Though Warnie was a brilliant man, but his debilitating alcoholism was just worsening by the week. And yet, here they are. Lewis's wife has died. Warnie remained a bachelor. All he had was the bottle and Jesus. And they had each other. Once again, as in the earliest days, we could turn for comfort only to each other. The will had come full circle. Once again, we were together in the little end room at home, shutting out from our talk the ever-present knowledge that the holidays were ending, that a new term fraught with unknown possibilities awaited us both. Jack faced the prospect bravely and calmly. Quote, "I have done all I wanted to do, and I'm ready to go," he said to me one evening. Only once did he show any regret or reluctance. This was when I told him that the morning's mail included an invitation to deliver the Romaines lecture. An expression of sadness passed over his face, and there was a moment's silence. Then he said, "Send them a very polite refusal." Friday, 22nd November 1963, began much as other days. There was breakfast, then letters, and the crossword puzzle. After lunch, Jack fell asleep in his chair. I suggested he would be more comfortable in bed, and he went there. At 4, I took in his tea and found him drowsy but comfortable. Our few words then were the last. At 5:30, I heard a crash and ran in to find him lying unconscious at the foot of his bed. He ceased to breathe some 3 or 4 minutes later. The funeral was November 26, 1963, at Lewis's parish church here, there in Oxford. You'll recall him having died on November 22nd, 1963. The reason this didn't make the news, though he had considerable celebrity, was because JFK died that day at Dealey Plaza. Another one who didn't quite make the news that day, as we've said, was Aldous Huxley. Three unique worldviews represented, dying the same day. The funeral, again, November 26, 1963, at Lewis's Parish Church. Tolkien and Barfield were present. His tombstone, which covers both Jack and Warnie, they're buried together. Warnie died 10 years later, the same year that Tolkien died, 73. The tombstone, which covers Jack and Warnie, has the following words that were commissioned by Warnie from the Shakespearean calendar. Do you remember the Shakespearean calendar from our very first night together? I mean, talk about coming full circle. Do you remember when their mother died? The day that she died, on this calendar that had Shakespeare quotations on each day, the day that she died, they never flipped the calendar over again. They just left it there as little boys. The calendar was not moved again. It just remained on that day. And the quotation on that day of their mother's death, all those years ago, are the words that Warnie commissioned to have on Jack's tombstone from Shakespeare. In loving memory of my brother, Clive Staples Lewis, born Belfast, 29th November 1898, died in this parish, 22nd November 1963. Men must endure their going hence. Those were the words that were on that Shakespearean calendar on their wall on the day that their mother had died. Think about that. Warnie had held on to those words all these years, and when his brother dies, those are the words that he has engraved into what would become their shared tombstone. Well, as a child bent on pursuing joy, to a young man atheist convinced there is none to be had, a person who is infinite joy pursued him on Addison's Walk. And then as an old man who had written much about joy throughout his life, a person named Joy pursued him, coming across the Atlantic to find him, until at her imminent loss, that old man pursued Joy Davidman and made her his wife. And thus concludes C.S. Lewis in The Pursuit of Joy. So what I want us to do now, we have some time here.
What is the book that he wanted?
Oh, what is the book that he wanted? Great question. The book that he wanted. Any guesses the book that he wanted? Did I say Harry Potter? Did somebody say Harry Potter? I'm sorry? The Fairy Queen. That's a really good guess.
I said Bible.
The Bible would have been with him by his side. Here's the interesting thing about Lewis. He breathed Bible. One of the things that Lewis criticized students in his day at Cambridge, there was a shift among students and their ability to write and their ability to think. They had become just indoctrinated with modernism. And they were coming to school having had no experience with the Bible and the classics. And that was why they couldn't think. And that was why they couldn't write. So both good guesses here. I'm sorry?
Bleak House.
One more time.
Bleak House by Dickens.
Bleak House by Dickens. That would have been an interesting choice. Why would you say that?
I had read that he
Yes.
the last couple of weeks of his life.
He did Bleak House. You're exactly right. It's not the book that I'm looking for, but he was very much, as was Chesterton, a great fan of Dickens. And particularly, he loved Bleak House and other things. My favorite Dickens is The Old Curiosity Shop. The Old Curiosity Shop. Maybe we'll do a Dickens thing sometime. Any Dickens fans in here? My daughter and I right now are reading A Christmas Carol together. And we're doing a year-long reading plan of classic literature and discussing it. Now, the book that he wanted the last couple of weeks of his life was Virgil's Aeneid. He actually thought the Aeneid was the pinnacle of all classic literature. So if Lydia and I stay on our plan, we're going to be reading the Iliad this year and the Odyssey next year, and then we'll maybe do the Aeneid later next year. But for him, the Aeneid was the greatest achievement of any man's pen. And he wanted the Aeneid, and not only did he want the Aeneid, he wanted his papers. What did he mean by that? I have it back here. I'll find it and bring it out here in a minute. He actually had begun work on his own translation of the Aeneid some years earlier and then had left it off. And now, as he is declining, he wanted his papers brought to him so he could start work again on his translation of the Aeneid. And I have back here his partially finished translation of the Aeneid. But I want us to think about the book, A Grief Observed. And if you would permit me, I want to let you in. You talk about Joy having a dream come true because she got to go to Greece. I actually lived out one of my, really the last several months, I've lived out some of my greatest dreams. I was this past summer at the Beinecke Rare Manuscript and Book Library at Yale and got to work a whole day with the manuscripts and sermon manuscripts and treatises of Jonathan Edwards that are preserved there. Got to hold them in my hands. Again, the previous year, as y'all can see here, we made our way to Oxford. But one of the things that I got to do while I was in Oxford, in fact, our host who was driving us around over there, being so gracious, taking us from place to place, as we drove away from the kilns, and we were going to head back into Oxford and see some things there. We were driving away. We were probably a mile away. And we were on if you've ever been over there, you know that you always think you can do more than you actually can. And we were kind of up against the clock in some ways. But it dawned on me that the thing that I probably wanted to do, maybe more than anything, was what I got to do here. And I'm going to share it with you. I said to everybody in the cars, Diane and Lydia and Warren in the car, and I said, y'all, I'm so sorry. Could you indulge me? I know we did the tour's over. Can we just go back to the kilns? I want to do something. And so we went back to the kilns, and I sat in the garden, Lewis and Jack and Joy's garden, where they would, that picture of them where she's crocheting and he's, sparking a dart. They're sitting in this garden, and that's where they would sit for hours every day and just talk and be together and read and crochet. And so I got to sit in their little garden and read from this raggedy old trade paperback edition of A Grief Observed. Ken has much nicer editions over there, but he doesn't have one that's been to the kilns. And he doesn't have the edition that has carried me through some of the deepest grief of my life. And I wanted to read the opening couple of paragraphs, which to me, probably outside the Bible, probably nothing has given lyric to the minor key music that I have felt at times in my life, like the opening couple of paragraphs. So I'm gonna play this. This is in Lewis's garden. Hopefully the sound. Let's see here.
Yep.
No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting, yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. There are moments, most unexpectedly, when something inside tries to assure me that I don't really mind so much, not so very much after all. Love is not the whole of a man's life. I was happy before I ever met H. I have plenty of what are called resources. People get over these things. Come, I shan't do so badly. One is ashamed to listen to this voice, but it seems for a little to be making out a good case. Then comes a sudden jab of red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. Lydia with that dramatic pan of the iPhone to the kilns. So, what did you think? Having read A Grief Observed, raw, full of doubt. It doesn't have a nice little sort of, how would I say it? It's hard to find much in this book that would have been usable for a Dayspring Christian greeting card. You remember those back in the day? I worked at a Christian bookstore, and we didn't have Hallmark cards. We had Dayspring greeting cards. Probably not going to find a whole lot in a book like this, which is just screaming out with raw, unfiltered pain. I mean, here is Lewis, this apologist, who has brought so many people to the Lord, both sides of the Atlantic, and yet, as Warnie says, it ends with faith. But he takes us through all the passages of pain and heartache. He's never blasphemous, but I would say he's like the psalmist at times. How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? I come to you and it's like you just shut the door and it's locked and double locked. Kind of like Warnie said last week, I tried to pray and found the line dead. But that opening passage for me, and especially that line at the very end, where he says, you know, time will take these things away. Not gonna hurt so bad after all. And then comes a sudden jab of red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. So let's talk a little bit about A Grief Observed. Thoughts or a passage that you want to read or discuss or ask a question about?
Dave, you mentioned stream of consciousness.
Tell you what, I'm going to run the microphone back to you.
You mentioned stream of consciousness as a style. It strikes me that this, I don't know how many works like this exist that are in fact stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's not an author saying, I'm going to create a character and I'm going to get inside their mind and I'm going to write as if their thoughts were simply falling out. This is
Yeah.
a man's thoughts falling out. And it
Yeah.
almost felt as though chapter 4 were a different book.
Yeah,
Because there he starts to heal
he starts to
in a very
heal.
real sense. And the first 3 chapters have been just his thoughts, his pain, his feelings.
Yeah,
With structure, with art, with whatever clarity he can muster. But there's no way to describe it without actually reading it. It's unlike anything else.
it's unlike it. Yeah, it's hard to describe what A Grief Observed. You just have to read it. So again, 3 chapters of just raw. He's just bleeding out. And then you come to chapter 4, and he reminds himself of the verities of the Christian faith. And that's where he takes himself. But he allows himself, I won't say he allowed himself, I don't think he couldn't have allowed himself the pain. And yes, it is stream of consciousness, but because he's just so incredibly gifted, you know, it reads so beautifully. It never just feels haphazard or inarticulate. But you read the first 3 chapters and it's just grinding pain. And he refers to her as H. H. Why is that? Because we know her as Joy. Her name was Helen Joy Davidman. A couple of other thoughts. Yes, I.
So I didn't really see it as stream of consciousness so much, probably because the way I think about stream of consciousness is my own consciousness, which is all over the place,
Yeah.
all the time. I thought of it as a stream of process,
Yeah.
right? Like what I really liked about it is 1 to 2 to 3. You saw you saw sort of the devolution of his hope and of
Yeah.
his, he was thinking about himself, and he was thinking about how I'm only thinking about myself. What about her? And he started moving towards what about her. In the last chapter, he had a couple of things that I loved. That there's this little. He starts talking about how to think about this more appropriately, and he says, "Not my idea of God, but God. Not my idea of H, but H. Yes, and also not my idea of my neighbor, but my neighbor." Like as starting to really step away from your own sort of presuppositions. He has all of this imagery around the pictures and how there's not a good picture of her, and yet his imagination is going to create in her, or is going to create this lasting image of her that he doesn't. It's going to be false, and he doesn't want that. So I just thought that whole sort of series of process, and then the sort of brutal honesty of saying, well, what is God really, and what is she really?
Yeah.
And then that whole other excursus about if I were to ask her to come back, would that even be good for her? Right?
Yeah.
And so I love that part. I just thought it was. I thought I liked the brutal honesty, but I liked to see the process, and I liked seeing him work it out at the end.
Yeah.
And almost fall off the cliff, but not.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, well said, Si, well said.
David, could I read the passage that Si's referring to? Because
Yeah.
this is just incredible. So, if you have this one, it's page 65. He starts with this famous quote that we've all heard, and I want to read maybe 15, 16 lines, because the conclusion of this section is incredible. He says, you've heard this part, "I need Christ, not something that resembles him. I want H, not something that is like her. A really good photograph might become in the end a snare, a horror, and an obstacle." And here's what Si was referring to. Images, I must suppose, have their use, or they would not have been so popular. It makes little difference whether they are pictures and statues outside the mind or imaginative constructions within it. To me, however, their danger is more obvious. Images of the holy easily become holy images, sacrosanct. My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins.
Thank you for reading that. I'm glad you wanted to read that. You remember what he had said to Joy. He wrote when she asked him to autograph her copy of The Great Divorce, and he said, there are 3 idols I must divest myself of. A false view of God, a false view of my neighbor, and a false view of myself. One of the things I particularly love about reading an author over the entirety of their corpus is looking at literary devices, themes, nomenclature, things that come up. I see it in Calvin, I see it in Jonathan Edwards, probably Van Til, probably the 3 individuals with whom I am most deeply acquainted with their works. So I see similar things showing up again and again. And with Lewis, you see this. You'll see things in letters that just seem to be like a throwaway comment, and yet that same phrase or word will show up in one of his books in the most poignant and crucial way to the narrative. And so his mind was like this. His mind was this gathering place, and he kept everything there and could pull on it, at will, phraseology and themes and so forth. And so you'll see a theme show up in Lewis years earlier, and then it'll show up as if it's just fresh on his mind. And this is an example of that, because he had said that to her when he gave her that copy of, signed her copy of The Great Divorce. But now it's showing up here in his moment of grief. But where does he take it? He takes it to the incarnation. And I love what he says about the incarnation. There's a unique Christocentricity to Lewis. It is the incarnation that is ultimate reality, the reality of the God-man. That is ultimate reality. And it is so real that properly understood and embraced, we can't turn it into an idol. It won't allow that. It won't. So, right? So, Lucy asks Mr. Beaver about Aslan. Is he quite safe? And of course, safe. Who's thinking about safe? He's not safe, but he's good. Jesus cannot be, we can't domesticate and tame him and sort of recreate him in our own image. You see the same thing in Grief Observed going on here with him just saying, look, I've got nothing left. All of reality is terrifying me right now, were it not for the incarnation. That's the ultimate conclusion, is the incarnation. And it's similar, right, to in the silver chair. Jill at the stream with Aslan, she wants to be able to negotiate and manipulate Aslan, and he just will have none of it. And she says, you promise not to do anything if I come to you. And he says, I make no such promise. And that's the theme that shows up in Lewis over and again, where he says in Mere Christianity that to come to Jesus, expect him to take control of everything. And you can hold nothing back. He intends to utterly take you over. Well, that's where he gets to in chapter 4 of A Grief Observed. Three chapters of just white knuckling it, but in chapter 4, Jesus completely takes over. And I see in chapter 4 of A Grief Observed a similar posture that I see in the silver chair when Jill finally comes and starts lapping up the water out of the stream. And before she knows it, she's right between his two forepaws. Right? And then it says, and she thinks, I'm going to make a mad dash and get away. But then Lewis says, she knows in the whole that would be the worst possible thing she could do. And I think that's where he winds up in chapter 4. Chapter 3, you think, is he going to leave? Is he going to just fall off the cliff, as it were? No, in chapter 4, he is in between the two forepaws of Aslan, as it were. Yeah, Brad.
What you said, what Lewis said in the first chapters there at the very opening, it's and I experienced this when I went through my grief.
Yeah.
I never knew grief felt so much like fear.
Oh, that line.
It's just so powerful, and I was thinking about it as you were reading that again. It just brought back all the memories the first time
Yeah.
I read that, because it's such a will thing. And you come to the place, in that sense. And for me, reading A Grief Observed was witnessing a man just pouring his heart out and being so brutally honest with what he was going through. And then he comes to these conclusions. And after I read that, I actually, I wrote a song, and it's called The Dark Night of the Soul. And the chorus of the song goes, if I can remember without my guitar in my hand, sometimes it's hard to do that.
Yeah.
But it's in the dark night of the soul, you finally drop down on your knees, give up all of your control, and you lay it at his feet.
Mm-hmm.
There's no comfort anywhere. Through a veil of tears you knew, in the depths of your despair, he's waiting there for you.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
that I got that right out of that
Yeah.
book. That's what it meant to me. Is that fear, you finally just have to lay it at Christ's feet.
Yeah.
And I think that's the power in loss, and the ultimate enemy is death. The final enemy put under his feet is death.
Yeah.
When you see that, you experience it that closely. It's and I could tell that's what he was going through
Yeah.
as I read it.
Yeah. And that's beautiful, Brett. My goodness. And last week when Brett shared just that letter that you keep in your wallet, and I mean, it was just, yeah, I'd love to hear that song. So you need to play that for us someday. I've enjoyed these last several weeks with y'all, and hopefully this has given you an overview. Man, I love so much on the cutting room floor. I mean, I'm a little OCD, I think. My whole family thinks I am. I think I am, because like, in all seriousness, like, in all seriousness, y'all, like every day of the week, when you say the day Monday, I immediately think the color blue, or you say the number 5, I think the color black, or you say the day Wednesday, red. I mean, so there's some, strange wiring going on there, but every number corresponds to a color. Every day of the week corresponds to a color. I'm a little OCD, and so I had to really work hard to keep this manageable, or we would have gone down rabbit holes. And I mean, we would have gone down rabbit holes, out of which we never would have crawled. But, I'll just say, I have many more expensive editions of C.S. Lewis books back there. Again, I got several British first editions back there that I've picked up over the years. But I think I have none more valuable to me than this. I think I bought this, if I'm not mistaken, I think I bought this for $0.25 at a library sale in Antioch in the early 90s. In fact, I know that's where I got it. Was the library in Antioch was having a sale, and there it was. I paid 25 cents for this, and it's been to Oxford, and it's been read in C.S. Lewis's garden. I hope if you've not read it, you'll take time. I assure you that if you ever find yourself in a place of heartache, that opening line, no one ever told me that grief feels so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. And I thought when I saw that is exactly right. And again, he ultimately takes you to the incarnation. So here's the thing. We're going to take a Christmas break, but you have some homework. Your homework over the Christmas break, and Ken's going to be very excited about this, and I think he's probably come prepared for you, is you are to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I mean, can we just admit, this may be what got us all here to begin with. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you're going to enjoy it. It's my favorite thing to read at Christmas, honestly. You got to be reading some of this and some Harry Potter at Christmas as far as I'm concerned. Read this, and even if you've read it before, read it again. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to go on YouTube and look up a man named Dr. Michael Ward, W-A-R-D. Now, you can find his videos, and I don't know if Ken has the book over here. He has a book entitled Planet Narnia. Planet Narnia. That is essentially his doctoral dissertation. The slimmed down, easier to get through version is this one here, the Narnia Code. Now, if you are a fan of Lewis, you may know this already. If you don't, you probably at least know that Tolkien never could make sense of Narnia. It seemed to him what he called slapdash. Slapdash. Tolkien was so meticulous, and every single sentence, you could do a dissertation on one sentence in Tolkien. But Narnia seems a little like, well, he said it, slapdash, and it just doesn't seem to make sense. And you got things like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who shows up out of nowhere? Santa Claus. what in the world is Santa Claus doing in Narnia? And Tolkien just never could see how it made sense.
And Bacchus shows up.
Do what now?
Bacchus shows up. on one of these.
Yeah, exactly. It seemed this strange combobulation of characters from all over the place in this fantasy land called Narnia, and Tolkien wasn't impressed. But here's the thing. Jack planted an Easter egg in every single of the Chronicles of Narnia, all 7. And he took it to his grave. And he resisted the temptation at an Inklings meeting as Tolkien was making some snide comment about why does Santa Claus show up. Lewis resisted the temptation to just say, okay guys, let me tell you the secret. And they would have heard it and they would have thought, oh my goodness, there is a trajectory, there is an architectonic principle to the Chronicles of Narnia, these children's books. There is a secret architectonic principle that binds them all together, and that's why they're not slapdash. They're far from it. It's so sophisticated and so secret, and Lewis took it to his grave. And Tolkien never figured it out, but Michael Ward did. And so this book here, the Narnia Code, you can get, or Planet Narnia, which I don't know if Planet Narnia, the bigger version of it's over here. But what I want you to do is read Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe and go on YouTube, and you can just look up any number. If you just type in Michael Ward, Planet Narnia, you'll find where he has a lengthier set of lectures on each of the Chronicles of Narnia, or just like a 1-hour overview of his thesis. Watch that over the holidays and read Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. We're going to come back in February. You'll see on my Instagram, if you're not following me on Instagram, that's where I update everyone and everything. So follow me on Instagram. You'll also see, we'll have flyers at Ken's store and at the church on the screens and here at the school as well. And we'll get the word out. But we're going to start back up in February. If you want to, I tell you what, if you want to be on an email list, just email me at the church, dfilson@christpres.org, and I'll create an email list, and that we can at least get word out that way about when we start back up. But again, you'll see. Debbie will create, as I was saying, Debbie will create the email list. So why don't you do this? Why don't you email dpixley at christpres.org, and we'll get word out to everybody. But again, it'll go out on all our regular channels, and just I'll start ramping up toward it on my Instagram as well. But what we're going to do next semester, now that we've done C.S. Lewis, The Pursuit of Joy, will be C.S. Lewis, Apologetics and Imagination. We're going to spend a couple of weeks looking at Narnia, a couple of weeks looking at Ransom, and a couple of weeks looking at Mere Christianity. So I look forward, hopefully, to seeing all of you back, and hopefully the weather may be a little better. Of course, it'll be the spring. We'll still have rain, but hopefully the weather will be a little bit better. Thanks to Ken for being here every Thursday night, hauling these books in and out. Christmas is coming. You got stockings to stuff. This is a great way to finish up your Christmas shopping list. If you don't have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you can walk out of it here tonight, but he'd prefer you pay for it first. Y'all, thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next semester. Gracious Father, thank you for these dear ones. Thank you for the incarnation, which is at bottom our only hope and confidence. Lord Jesus, in our suffering, in our solitude, in our joy, pursue us. And Lord, we pray that even as we take time off here over the next few weeks and we enter the realms of Narnia, Lord, would you give us to see that indeed Aslan is good. We ask all of it in the name of Jesus, our true Savior. Amen.